Pokemon Trading Card Game, or more helpfully known as Pokemon Card GB in Japan, is a card battle and role-playing game for the Game Boy Color based on the real-life Pokemon TCG, with over 200 cards from its earliest expansions and promos to collect and duel with against NPC opponents. However, there were also some new cards that were never printed before and were specifically designed for the game. A total of 18 Game Boy exclusive cards exist, and the majority of them possessed attacks that involved randomness, for example choosing random cards in play or random types of cards from your deck, things that would be too complicated and time-consuming to truly recreate in the tabletop game, which makes their inclusion pretty novel and takes advantage of the video game format. Most of these Game Boy cards are admittedly pretty useless, but the random effects are kind of interesting to examine. Marowak's Whale attack for 3 fighting energy fills each player's bench with random basic Pokemon from their decks. I can't think of a use for this attack, but if you can, please tell me because I want to use it. Jigglypuff's Friendship Song puts a random basic Pokemon from your deck onto your bench if you flip a coin and get heads. Ninetales' first attack, Mix-Up, shuffles all of the Pokemon from your opponent's hand into their deck, then replaces them with an equal number of Pokemon chosen at random from their deck. You'd want to combine this effect with Ammonite's Clairvoyance power for some possible hand disruption. Also, Ninetales' second attack, Dancing Embers, flips 8 coins and does 10 damage for each heads. If you count Ninetales as a real Pokemon card, it would hold the record for the most coin flips in an attack's text. We had cards with 4 flips since Jungle, a few cards with 5 flips starting in Gym Heroes, even fewer cards with 6 flips from X and Y, and nothing above that. Until Slowpoke and Psyduck Tag Team GX, with a possible 10 flips for 100 damage each. Oh well. Magnemite's Magnetic Storm attack removes all energy cards attached to your Pokemon and randomly reattaches them. Say you have a Pokemon all ready to attack, but then you think, that's too useful, so you use this. Great. Pidgeot's first attack, Slicing Wind, does 30 damage to one of your opponent's Pokemon chosen at random, but its second attack, Gale, for 4 colorless energy, does 20 damage and then switches both players' active Pokemon with a random one from their bench. Ditto has the very unique attack Morph. Remove all damage counters from Ditto. For the rest of the game, replace Ditto with a copy of a basic Pokemon card, other than Ditto, chosen at random from your deck. Ditto is no longer asleep, confused, paralyzed, poisoned, or anything else that might be the result of an attack, just as if you had evolved it. Again, I can't think of a way to actually utilize this, but you can get 5 or 6 of the same Pokemon in play with this attack, which would otherwise be impossible, as all decks are only allowed up to 4 copies of the same card or Pokemon. Now we've arrived at the legendary cards, which in contrast may be among the best cards in the game. They're held by the 4 Grand Masters, whom you must defeat to receive the cards and beat the game. The cards all share some common features: 100 HP, a Pokemon power, an attack for 3 energy, no weakness, and a retreat cost of 2. They also share a resistance to fighting, which comes from their shared part flying type in the main games. Moltres has the Pokemon power Fire Giver, which puts 1 to 4 fire energy from your deck into your hand when you put it onto the bench. Its attack, Dive Bomb, does 70 damage if you flip heads, otherwise it does nothing. Not a very consistent card, but it hits for the crucial 70 HP shared by many common basic Pokemon, and its energy surging ability makes it easy to prepare for battle. Articuno's Quick Freeze power flips a coin, and if it's heads, the defending Pokemon is paralyzed. Its Ice Breath attack does 40 damage to one of your opponent's Pokemon chosen at random, ignoring weakness and resistance. It's useful for spreading damage while keeping the defending Pokemon frozen in place. Zapdos' Pokemon power is Peal of Thunder, which does 30 damage to another Pokemon, yours or your opponent's, when you put it on the bench. Its attack, Big Thunder, does 70 damage to a random Pokemon in play, ignoring weakness or resistance. Like Articuno's Ice Breath attack, but it can target your own Pokemon as well. Out of this trio though, this card can do the most damage if you stack the odds in your favor. In addition to keeping the lowest possible number of Pokemon on your bench, you can use Pokemon Flute to put a basic Pokemon from your opponent's discard pile onto their bench, making one of their Pokemon more likely to be randomly chosen. Plus, since all the birds have 100 HP, they'll survive a Big Thunder if they're unlucky enough to be chosen, so you can return them to your hand with Scoop Up, which you'll probably be using anyway to reuse their Pokemon powers. Speaking of which, these are the only cards in the game whose Pokemon powers activate when being played onto the bench. These are what's known as coming into play abilities and wouldn't be introduced into the physical TCG until the Team Rocket expansion, which wasn't included in the Game Boy game. The last card on this list is one of two Phantom cards, which are only available through a feature called Card Pop, which gives you and another player a random card from the game's sets. However, there's an extremely small chance that you'll receive a Phantom card instead, and this Mew is one of them, possessing possibly the most random attack of all. This attack does a random number of damage and may cause a special condition to the defending Pokemon. Unfortunately, this random number of damage is actually quite limited. Looking at the code, there's exactly 8 outcomes, each with an equal chance of happening. 10 damage, 10 damage and paralysis, 10 damage and poison, 10 damage and sleep, 10 damage and confusion, 10 damage and heal Mew by 10 HP, 20 damage, and doing nothing. Wonderful. It's really just a novelty card, but one that very few players have ever seen in action. But what if I told you that some of these cards were not actually Game Boy exclusive? In fact, this was true as soon as the game released, as it came with a physical Pokemon card in the box, a holofoil Dragonite in Japan, and a holo Meowth outside of Japan. Both feature the GB symbol present in the game, but the Meowth also features the Wizards of the Coast Black Star promo symbol as its promo number 10. Japanese Pokemon cards would actually go unnumbered until a Pokemon Versus set in 2001, but more on that some other time. Since Dragonite is the only card out of the legendary cards to not utilize randomness, it could be printed without any alterations. However, since the Game Boy Meowth was chosen to replace Dragonite for whatever reason, its Cat Punch attack had to be altered to remove the random targeting effect. Instead, it reads, flip a coin. If heads, this attack does 20 damage. If tails, and if your opponent has any bench Pokemon, he or she chooses one of them and this attack does 20 damage to it. This was not the only time this Meowth card was printed though. In fact, right after Pokemon Card GB released in Japan, a non-holo Japanese print was included in the February 1999 issue of CoroCoro Comic, a popular Japanese manga magazine that's featured numerous Pokemon promos over the years. This was over a year before the card was released in English with the game. Not long after, a non-holo version of that English card was released in Japan as another promo and was awarded to passengers of the West Japan Railway Company for completing the JR West Pokemon Stamp Rally 2000, which lasted barely over a month, making this version much rarer than the other two. Also, Meowth's level on the physical card is listed as level 13, but it's level 14 in the Game Boy game. Another card released through print media is the other Phantom card, Venusaur, which was included in the Pokemon Card GB official guidebook, published in Japan by Creatures Inc., the creators of the Pokemon TCG. This strategy guide details every card, deck, area, and secret within the game, as well as an explanation of the card game's rules. Similarly, Nintendo Power published their own official Nintendo Player's Guide after the game's release in English, which included the Venusaur as another Black Star promo. This version has a fully holographic background, whereas the original is holo only on the sky. Almost 3 years after the release of Pokemon Card GB in Japan, 2 more Game Boy cards were printed as part of the Japanese Pokemon Center Online exclusive Pokemon Web expansion. Released in October 2001, This set consisted of reprints of some base set, jungle, and Team Rocket cards, as well as many miscellaneous promos. The only cards not printed before were this Tangela and this Electrode. None of their attacks had random effects, so their cards weren't altered. Now, since we've seen that some of these Game Boy exclusive cards existed as real cards complete with their original illustrations, were there cards made for all of them? As it turns out, yes, and they were actually shown in the legendary Pokemon Card Official Book 2000, referred to as the Silver Bible. This thing has super high quality pictures of every Pokemon card ever released up until Neo Genesis, as well as pictures of TCG merchandise and tournaments. Rare promos, trophy cards, the Pokemon Snap cards, the Pikachu trophies, Grand Party and Pikachu Illustrator, and scans of the original prototype Game Boy cards. Cards that were eventually printed are placed elsewhere in their Pokemon section, except for Tangela and Electrode, which hadn't yet been turned into their Pokemon web cards when this book was released. There's also some minor inconsistencies between these mock-ups and the final digital cards, like how Phantom Mew was originally facing left instead of right. The in-game card was probably flipped due to this exact art of Mew being used for a previous card that's also in the game and uses the same sprite art. This Vaporeon's first attack was originally going to cost 2 colorless energy instead of 1, but I think when the developers realized that this card is just a much worse version of Scyther, being a stage 1 and having a retreat cost and colored attack cost, they felt bad and lowered Focus Energy's cost to match Swords Dance. There's one more detail I noticed while researching these cards, and it's with Meowth. Unlike all 17 other Game Boy cards that use Ken Sugimori stock art over random backgrounds from photo packs, Meowth's illustration is actually an original and drawn by Himeno instead. Comparing this artwork to the Game Boy sprite art, they're similar but clearly not the same as every other in-game card, which matches its real-life counterpart exactly. I think this makes Meowth the only instance of the game developers actually creating the card first with no reference, and the physical card and illustration being later based off of that, which is pretty cool. There's actually a lot more to talk about with the Pokemon trading card game video game, but I had so much to go over that I decided to split everything into self-contained parts, with this being the first one. So I'll get more into the actual game soon, unless people just want videos on Pokemon cards, but I think they're similar enough. So tell me what you think